I'm going to keep this as tight and relevant as possible. I'm 22 years old, freshly graduated from college, and up until recently, I never believed anything truly sinister was happening to my family. Now, I'm not so sure. My family has lived in the same 3-story house for as long as I can remember, since I was about 3 or 4 years old. It's in a quiet, upper-middle-class suburban neighborhood, tree-lined streets, well-kept lawns, the kind of place where nothing bad is supposed to happen. The layout of the house matters here. My bedroom is on the 2nd floor, and my window faces the street. My dad's home office is on the 3rd floor, and its only window also faces the street. No other rooms in the house have a direct view of the road. The reason I'm writing all of this now is because of something that happened last week. Something that made me look back and realize this may have been going on for over a decade. The first incident happened so long ago that I barely remember it myself. I was still in middle school at the time, so this would have been at least 10 or 11 years ago. It was a weekend morning, and I was walking downstairs for breakfast when I overheard my parents talking in the kitchen. I didn't hear much, just my dad saying that something had happened again. His tone was low and tense, the kind adults use when they don't want kids listening in. When I asked what they were talking about, they brushed it off. They didn't tell me the real story for over a year. I eventually learned what actually happened from my older brother. My dad is a lawyer, and back then he often worked late into the night at home when deadlines piled up. On that particular night, he was in his office on the 3rd floor, working sometime around midnight, when he noticed a vehicle driving down our street. It was a Chevy Suburban, and it was moving painfully slowly, maybe 5 miles per hour. According to my dad, it looked like the driver had taken their foot off both the gas and the brake and was just letting the car crawl forward. At first, he didn't think much of it, until the same Suburban came back down the street a few minutes later, this time in the opposite direction. Then it stopped. The car parked directly across the street from our house. My dad watched it for several minutes, expecting someone to get out. No one did. The engine stayed on. No doors opened. No movement inside that he could see. Eventually, he went back to work, glancing out the window every so often. Hours passed. Nothing changed. Around 2 a.m., exhausted, he fell asleep at his desk without finishing his work. When he woke around 5:30 a.m., the car was still there. Same spot, same position. The Suburban didn't leave until just before sunrise. That alone might not sound terrifying, but my dad later admitted this wasn't the first time he'd noticed strange cars slowly driving back and forth on our street late at night. This was just the most extreme case. At the time, my parents tried to rationalize it. Maybe someone sleeping in their car, maybe someone casing houses in a nice neighborhood. Eventually, life moved on. But that wasn't the end of it. Years passed after that first incident, and nothing overtly strange happened. At least nothing that felt important at the time. Whatever my dad had seen slowly faded into the background of family lore, filed away as a creepy but ultimately harmless coincidence. Then I turned 15. I was a sophomore in high school. And like most nights back then, I was up late in my bedroom making beats. Music was my obsession at the time, and I'd often lose track of time with my headphones on, completely absorbed. As I mentioned earlier, my desk sat directly in front of my bedroom window, which faced the street. I could see outside without even trying. That's why the light caught my attention. At first, it was just a brief flicker, so quick I almost dismissed it as a reflection from my screen. But then it happened again and again. It wasn't random, and it definitely wasn't natural. I took my headphones off and looked out the window. There were at least 3 cars driving slowly down the street in a loose formation. They weren't speeding, and they weren't stopped. They were crawling forward at a deliberate pace. Then I realized what the flickering light was. Flashlights. Someone in the first car was shining a flashlight directly at the houses as they passed. I watched in stunned silence as the beam swept across my neighbor's front yard, then their windows. Then it reached my house. The moment I realized the beam was about to pass my window, my body reacted before my brain did. I ducked down below the windowsill. 2 seconds later, the flashlight beam swept across my ceiling. I froze. The light lingered for a moment, just long enough to make my stomach drop, then moved on. Everything went dark again. I stayed crouched there for at least 20 seconds, barely breathing. When I finally dared to look back out the window, the cars were already near the end of the street. I watched them turn the corner and disappear. I didn't sleep much that night. The next morning, I told my parents everything. To their credit, they took it seriously. As a family, we agreed on the most logical explanation: a group of people casing houses, looking for empty ones or easy targets. Still, the idea that strangers had been shining flashlights directly into our home was deeply unsettling. My dad didn't waste any time. He installed a Ring doorbell camera and added motion-activated security cameras with lights in the backyard. I'm pretty sure he also spoke with a few neighbors to see if anyone else had seen something similar, though I don't remember what came of that. For a while, the increased security gave us peace of mind. Then, a couple of years later, something happened that made it impossible to believe this was just random. My dad had hired landscapers to do some work in our backyard. One afternoon, one of the contractors came to him holding something small and black in his hand. It was a camera. Tiny, no bigger than a car key. It had been hidden deep inside a bush near the fence line, angled toward our house. It was battery-powered, and the battery had long since died. There was no SIM card and no memory card inside, which meant it hadn't been storing footage locally. That didn't make it any better. If anything, it made it worse. The most likely explanation was that it had been live streaming footage to someone nearby while it was active, someone close enough to receive the signal. And then, once the battery died, it had simply been abandoned. Why anyone would go to the trouble of hiding a camera on our property and then never come back for it was a complete mystery. My dad was furious. He reviewed months of security footage but couldn't find anything showing when or how the camera had been placed there. Our parents were genuinely scared we were being targeted, and they reported the incident to the police. There wasn't much law enforcement could do. Our security setup was already about as good as it could get. Nothing happened for a while after that. No strange cars, no lights, no obvious surveillance. Life went on again, because when nothing happens long enough, you start to convince yourself it never will.
A few years after the hidden camera was discovered, our immediate next-door neighbors moved out. Their house didn't stay empty for long, maybe a few weeks at most, which wasn't unusual for our neighborhood. Houses there tended to sell quickly. The new occupants, however, stood out. Instead of a family, a young couple moved in. No kids, no pets that I ever saw. Given the size of the house, I found that a little odd, but not suspicious. Plenty of people buy larger homes for future plans, or simply because they can afford to. At first. Not long after they moved in, I began noticing something strange. Their house, like ours, had a top-floor window that overlooked our backyard. On multiple occasions, always at unusual hours, either very early in the morning or late at night, I noticed one or both of them standing at that window, looking directly into our yard. At first, I assumed it was an office or a workspace, and they were just standing near the window while thinking or talking on the phone. But after a while, I realized they were never sitting, always standing, always still, watching. I told myself I was being paranoid. I've always been an observant person, sometimes to a fault. When you notice patterns, it's easy to assign meaning where there may be none, so I brushed it off. Then, one night while walking my dog, I noticed something that stuck with me. As I passed their house, I glanced through their large bay window and saw them sitting at their kitchen table. For the first time since they'd moved in, there was a third person with them. The man was immediately memorable. He was completely bald, very muscular, and had unusually thick, dark eyebrows. His face was so distinctive that it felt impossible to forget once you'd seen it. The three of them were simply sitting there, talking, nothing overtly strange. But the moment I slowed down and looked a little longer, the woman suddenly stood up, walked to the window, and pulled the curtains shut. She didn't look out at me. None of them did. Still, the timing felt deliberate, as if she somehow knew I was watching. I continued walking, trying to shake the uneasy feeling in my gut, but the image of that man stayed with me. Something about his face lodged itself in my memory in a way I couldn't explain. After that, I noticed the couple watching our yard less frequently, or maybe they were just better at not being seen. Either way, nothing else happened for a long time. Years passed. I graduated high school. Life moved forward. The strange incidents became stories I occasionally thought about, but never truly dwelt on. Until last week. And that's when everything I thought I'd rationalized came crashing back, all at once. Last week, my family traveled to Paris. The trip had been planned for months. My older brother had been dating his girlfriend for years, and everyone quietly expected him to propose while we were there. Both families were on the trip. My parents, my brothers, his girlfriend, and her parents. A few days in, we ended up at a small bar one night. Nothing fancy, just drinks, laughter, and that relaxed vacation feeling you get when you're far from home. At some point, I drifted out of the conversation and glanced across the room. That's when I saw him. He was sitting alone in a booth, casually sipping his drink and scanning the room. Something about him immediately felt familiar, though I couldn't place it at first. Then it hit me all at once. It was the man from my neighbor's kitchen. Same bald head, same muscular build, same thick, unmistakable eyebrows. My heart started racing. I told myself it was impossible. The odds that some random guy I'd seen years ago in my suburban neighborhood would be sitting in the same bar as my family in Paris were absurd. I tried to convince myself I was projecting. Then he looked at me. We locked eyes. It lasted only a few seconds, but in that moment, I knew he recognized me too. There was no confusion in his expression, just a calm, measured awareness. He knew that I knew. Without finishing his drink or speaking to anyone, he stood up and walked out of the bar. I immediately excused myself and tried to follow him, but by the time I got outside, he was gone. No sign of him in either direction. I went back inside and forced myself to sit through the rest of the night, telling myself it had to be a coincidence. It was the only way I could stay sane. But a few days later, that explanation stopped working.
We were out doing tourist things in broad daylight, walking through the city near one of the major landmarks. That's when I saw him again. Same man. He was standing maybe 50 feet away, holding a professional-looking camera and taking photos. From where I stood, it looked like he was photographing a monument behind us, but something about the angle made my stomach drop. It felt like the camera was pointed at us. After a moment, he lowered the camera, turned a corner, and disappeared into the crowd. That was when I finally told my parents everything. I explained who the man was, where I'd seen him before, and why there was no possible way this was random. To my surprise, they believed me, especially my dad. He even suggested we cut the trip short. We didn't end up doing that, but the rest of the vacation was ruined. Every public place felt exposed. Every stranger felt like a potential observer. When we got home, my dad immediately checked all the security footage we had stored. There was nothing. No unfamiliar faces, no strange cars, no answers. But by then, I was convinced of one thing. This wasn't coincidence, and whatever had been watching us for years was still watching.
What you're about to hear could steal your sleep. So tell me, where are you sitting? How scared are you? Comment below, and if you're new, subscribe now or you'll miss the next terror. After we got back home, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. Like whatever had been watching from a distance for years had finally crossed some invisible line. A few days later, I got some bad news over the phone. The kind that makes your chest feel tight and your thoughts spiral. I didn't want to drink. I didn't want to talk. I just needed to get out of the house. So I went for a hike. I live near Angeles National Forest, and I've been hiking those trails for years. I know them well enough that getting lost has never really been a concern. Night hikes aren't unusual for me, especially on familiar routes. There's usually something calming about being out there in the dark. That night, though, was different. I set out around 8 p.m., planning nothing ambitious, just enough distance to clear my head. The fog rolled in fast and thick. Even though I'd checked the weather, visibility dropped to maybe 20 feet once I got deeper into the trail. I tried using my flashlight at first, but the beam reflected straight back off the moisture in the air. It made everything worse, like driving with high beams in heavy snow. So I kept it off most of the time and let my eyes adjust. I had music playing through my headphones to deter animals, something my dad had always recommended. About an hour in, I noticed a smell. It was faint, but strange enough that I stopped walking. It didn't smell like damp earth or pine or anything natural. It smelled like perfume, floral and clean, completely out of place in the middle of the forest at night. I scanned the fog, which was pointless. By the time I finished looking around, the smell was gone. 10 minutes later, I smelled something else. Campfire smoke. That one made more sense. I figured someone might be camping somewhere nearby, and maybe the earlier smell had drifted from them as well. But the smoke only lingered for about 30 seconds before vanishing entirely. The third smell is when I knew something wasn't right. It was herbal and earthy, instantly familiar in a way that made my skin crawl. I recognized it from my childhood, but I couldn't place where from. The familiarity, combined with how wrong it felt in that moment, unsettled me deeply. I should have turned around then. Instead, I kept walking. For a while, things felt normal again. My breathing slowed. My thoughts settled. I started convincing myself I was just on edge because of everything that had happened recently. And then I saw the light. A flashlight beam flicked on along a ridge to my left. The ridge runs parallel to the main trail, but sits roughly 100 feet higher. There are no marked trails up there, no safe access points. I know that for a fact because I've studied maps and even tried figuring out how to get up there before. The terrain is too steep, too dangerous, yet the beam kept appearing. It would turn on, sweep a section of the ridge, shut off, then reappear somewhere else a few seconds later. That's when I realized the music in my headphones was a mistake. I turned it off and listened. Someone was whistling. Not frantically, not randomly, casually. And if I could hear them, they had definitely heard my music. By the time I realized how exposed I was already several miles into the trail. The smart thing would have been to turn around immediately. Instead, I convinced myself to keep going, at least a little farther. There was a small overlook up ahead that I knew well. I figured I'd stop there, take a break, and think things through. The moment I reached it, everything got worse. Sitting on a flat rock near the edge of the overlook was a small stone sculpture. I didn't need to examine it closely to know what it was. I'd seen things like that before. Deliberate arrangements, not something nature does by accident. My body reacted before my thoughts caught up. I stood up, turned around, and started heading back the way I'd come. That's when I heard the footsteps. They were fast, heavy, unmistakably human. Someone was running straight toward me through the fog. I barely had time to react. The footsteps closed the distance so quickly that running wasn't even an option. I stopped, braced myself, and prepared for a confrontation. Then the footsteps stopped, abruptly, right in front of me. I stared into the fog, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I couldn't see anything. No silhouette, no movement, nothing. That's when the realization hit me. If I couldn't see them, how did they know exactly where I was? I stood there for several seconds, frozen, convinced whoever had charged me was now standing just out of sight. Eventually, I pulled out the switchblade I always carried for protection and held my ground. Nothing happened. No footsteps, no breathing, no movement, just silence. The worst part was that the sound had come from the direction I needed to go to get back to my car. There was no alternate route. If I wanted to leave, I had to walk straight toward where those footsteps had come from. Waiting forever wasn't an option, so I moved. Every step felt deliberate, like I was walking into a trap. I fully expected to see someone emerge from the fog at any second, but nothing did. As I kept going, a new fear crept in, the feeling that I wasn't alone anymore. Every few minutes, I heard what sounded like an extra step or two, just slightly out of sync with my own, like someone was matching my pace behind me. I kept looking over my shoulder. Fog, every time. This went on for nearly a mile. Then, something crashed through the bushes behind me. It was loud enough to make me jump out of my skin. I couldn't control my reaction. I yelled out, pure panic taking over. I spun around, staring into the fog where the sound had come from. Still, nothing. That's when the genuine thought I was going to die out there. I broke into a run. Once I started, I didn't stop. I ran blindly down the trail, adrenaline burning through me, hearing branches snap and bushes crash somewhere behind me the entire time. I didn't slow down until I reached my car. I got inside, locked the doors, and sat there shaking. I still don't know what or who was chasing me that night.
The experience in the forest messed me up more than I like to admit. I stopped hiking for months after that night.
every explanation I came up with felt incomplete, like I was missing a crucial piece of the puzzle. Eventually, I did what I always do when I can't explain something. I shoved it into the back of my mind and tried to move on. But this isn't the first time something like that has happened to me. This next part goes back much further. I was 15 years old when it happened, during one of the most chaotic periods of my life. My parents were in the middle of an ugly divorce, and tensions at home were unbearable. My mom decided it would be best if I spent a few weeks away, so she sent me to stay with my great-aunt Lucy in upstate Vermont. I barely knew her. Aunt Lucy lived in a massive Victorian house that had been converted into apartments sometime in the 1960s. She owned the entire building. The top 2 floors were rented out to tenants, while she lived alone in a sprawling first-floor unit. The place was beautiful in an old, eerie way. High ceilings, original hardwood floors, ornate moldings around every doorway. It felt like a house that had stories soaked into the walls. One thing stood out immediately. Aunt Lucy avoided certain parts of her own apartment. She had a huge master bedroom with tall windows and antique furniture, but she didn't sleep there. Instead, she slept in a small den off the living room. When I asked her why, she told me the main bedroom got too much morning light. The answer didn't make sense. Trying to be polite, I jokingly asked if I could sleep in the master bedroom instead. She shot me a look that instantly shut me up. After that, I didn't ask any more questions. The first few nights I stayed there, I kept hearing footsteps coming from the apartment above us. At first, I assumed it was one of the tenants, maybe someone who worked late and paced around at night. But the footsteps weren't random. They were methodical, back and forth, end to end, over and over again. It sounded like someone pacing the length of the apartment. After about a week of hearing the footsteps every night, I finally mentioned it to Aunt Lucy during breakfast. The moment I brought it up, her expression changed. She told me the second-floor apartment had been vacant for over a month. I laughed at first, thinking she was joking. I insisted that someone was absolutely up there, that I heard them pacing every single night. She calmly shook her head and said I was just hearing the building settle. That explanation didn't sit right with me. Old buildings creak, sure, but they don't pace. The next morning, I told her I wanted to see the empty apartment. She hesitated, clearly uncomfortable, but after I kept pressing, she finally agreed. She unlocked the door and led me upstairs. The apartment was empty, no furniture, no boxes, no signs of anyone living there. But as we walked through the rooms, I noticed something immediately. Scuff marks on the hardwood floors. They were fresh, lighter than the surrounding wood, and they formed a clear path from the front of the apartment to the back, the exact route the footsteps followed every night. I pointed them out. Aunt Lucy barely glanced at the floor before dismissing it. She said they were probably from the previous tenants. I told her they looked recent. She ignored me. That night, something strange happened. She suggested we watch a movie together. That alone was unusual. We'd never done that before. As the movie played and the night went on, the footsteps upstairs started again, back and forth. I looked at Aunt Lucy, waiting for her to finally acknowledge them. Instead, she turned the volume up. She didn't react. She didn't ask if I heard anything. She just stared at the TV like nothing was happening. That's when it hit me. She knew. The next day, I called my mom and told her everything. The footsteps, the empty apartment, Aunt Lucy's behavior. And somehow my mom already knew. She told me not to bring it up with Aunt Lucy anymore, that it was, in her words, a sensitive topic. That response created a crack between us that never fully healed. Near the end of my visit, I woke up around 2 a.m. needing to use the bathroom. On my way back to my room, I glanced toward the staircase that led up to the second floor. The door at the bottom was slightly ajar, and I swear I saw a faint light moving around upstairs, like someone walking with a flashlight. I didn't investigate. I went straight to bed and didn't sleep. I just wanted to go home. What you're about to hear could steal your sleep. So tell me, where are you sitting? How scared are you? Comment below, and if you're new, subscribe now or you'll miss the next terror. After I got back home, I asked my mom about Aunt Lucy again. She refused to explain. Not then, not later, not ever. That silence caused a rift between us that lasted for years. It wasn't just about the footsteps or the apartment. It was about knowing she was withholding something important from me and choosing not to tell me. Years later, I learned more through a cousin. Aunt Lucy had eventually sold the building and moved to Florida. According to my cousin, there had been an incident in that apartment back in the 1990s. Someone had died there under unclear circumstances, and the family had tried to keep it quiet. That was around the same time Aunt Lucy inherited the building. I don't know how much of that story is true. Families exaggerate, people gossip, memories get distorted over time. And for the record, I don't believe in ghosts. I don't say that to sound dismissive or edgy. I just genuinely don't. I think ghosts are a lazy explanation for things we don't understand. So when I think back on what happened in that house, I always look for other possibilities. Maybe Aunt Lucy was hiding someone, an estranged relative, someone in trouble, someone who needed to stay out of sight. Maybe she was being blackmailed. Maybe the incident in the 90s wasn't as resolved as everyone wanted to believe, and someone still had leverage over her. Or maybe none of it is true. What I do know is that my mom knows more than she's ever told me, and that's something I don't think I'll ever forgive her for. As for the rest of it, the cars, the cameras, the man in Paris, the night in the forest, I don't have a clean explanation for any of it. Maybe they're all connected, maybe none of them are. All I know is that every time I think I've convinced myself it's over, something else happens that pulls me right back in. Some things don't come with answers, and maybe they never will.